1870, Texas. They said the boy could not understand them. They said it freely, on the porch in the yard, even when he stood close enough to hear the scrape of boots against dust. He was young, small for his years, with a way of keeping his eyes lowered that made men careless. When orders were spoken, they waved their hands instead, as one might do with an animal. Words, they believed, passed over him like wind through dry grass. But the boy listened. He learned which commands were meant to be obeyed and which were meant only to be heard. He learned that men spoke differently when they thought no one understood. And most of all, he learned that a spoken order, once given, could not be taken back. They thought he could not understand orders. They did not consider what might happen if he did. The belief that the boy could not understand orders did not come from a single moment. It was built gradually, layer by layer, through habit, convenience, and the dangerous comfort of certainty. On the plantation in 1870 Texas, assumptions were made as readily as fences were mended. Quickly, without care for what lay on the other side. The boy had arrived years earlier. Small even then, his age guessed rather than known. No one remembered the sound of his first words. If he had spoken them at all, he had been quiet from the beginning, not mute, but sparing. Silence for him was not emptiness, it was shelter. He learned early that words invited attention, and attention invited trouble. The master took this quiet for dullness. It pleased him to believe the boy slow. A child who did not answer was easier than one who asked. A child who nodded was simpler than one who questioned. When the boy failed to respond quickly, the master concluded it was not refusal, but ignorance. This thought settled comfortably in his mind, where it was never again disturbed. Soon others followed. The overseer, the field hands placed above the rest, even the house servants. Each adjusted their speech around the boy. They shortened sentences. They spoke louder than necessary, slower than needed. Eventually, they stopped speaking to him altogether and relied on gestures instead. A finger pointed toward the yard, a hand slicing the air to hurry him along, a tap of the boot when he lingered. The boy noticed this change. He noticed how words were reserved for those considered worth them. He noticed how orders spoken aloud carried weight, while gestures could be denied later. When a man spoke, he bound himself to what he said. When he waved his hand, the meaning could be shifted, blamed, or forgotten. So the boy remained quiet. In the mornings, when the master gave instructions from the porch, the boy stood close enough to hear, but was never addressed directly. His presence was accepted, like a post or a shadow. Men spoke over him, around him, past him. They discussed tools, routes, punishments, and plans, never lowering their voices, because lowering one's voice meant acknowledging a listener. They did not acknowledge him. Once, a visitor asked if the boy understood English at all. The master laughed and said, "Enough to fetch and carry." The remark was made lightly, without cruelty in tone, which made it more dangerous. Cruelty spoken softly tends to linger longer. From that day on, the boy was treated as though his understanding ended exactly where usefulness did. This assumption shaped everything that followed. Because he was thought incapable of comprehension, he was trusted with proximity. He stood near doors when men spoke inside. He lingered at fence posts while instructions were exchanged. He carried water while arguments unfolded over his head. His stillness made him invisible. The boy learned that invisibility was not absence. It was access. He began to listen with intention. Not the kind of listening that seeks permission, but the kind that waits. He listened for patterns, not meaning at first. The rise and fall of voices. The pause before a name was spoken. The way certain words were followed by action and others by silence. He learned that commands often sounded alike, but consequences did not. No one noticed his attention. Why would they? He did not look up. His face remained blank, his mouth closed. Men prefer surfaces that reflect nothing back at them. They called this emptiness. They called it stupidity. It never occurred to them that it might be discipline. The master, in particular, took comfort in the belief. He spoke freely when the boy was near, confident that words were wasted breath in that direction. Orders given in irritation were not measured. Instructions spoken in confidence were not guarded. The boy heard them all, standing with his hands folded, eyes on the ground. In this way, language was handed to him without consent. What made the assumption strongest was repetition. Every day the boy complied without comment. Every task was completed without question. Each silent obedience reinforced the lie they told themselves, that there was nothing happening behind his eyes. But the boy understood something they did not. He understood that knowledge gained quietly is safer than knowledge announced. He understood that to correct a false belief was to invite scrutiny, and scrutiny in that place was never gentle. So he allowed the assumption to harden. He let it become fixed, unquestioned, relied upon. He became the child they believed him to be, not by nature, but by design. And in doing so, he positioned himself exactly where they would never think to look, close enough to hear everything. Trusted with nothing, suspected of nothing at all. This false assumption was not merely an error. It was the opening they created themselves. And once an order is spoken aloud in the wrong presence, it belongs to more than the man who gave it. The boy did not begin by listening for meaning. At first, he listened only for survival. On the plantation in 1870 Texas, sound carried consequence. A raised voice meant hurry. A sharp name meant danger. Silence, when it came suddenly, meant something worse was being decided. The boy learned this long before he learned grammar. His ears learned before his mouth ever did. He stood still often, not because he was told to, but because stillness allowed sound to come to him unbroken. When one does not move, men forget to mind their words. They speak forward, not downward. They speak to the air, to each other, to their own tempers. The boy became skilled at occupying space without disturbing it. At first, his listening was accidental. Orders passed over him while he worked nearby. Snatches of conversation floated loose while tools were traded or horses watered. He caught fragments that did not yet fit together. Names without faces. Instructions without context. Words spoken too quickly to hold. But repetition is a teacher. The same phrases appeared again and again, always followed by the same outcomes. He noticed that when the overseer said a man's name before sunrise, that man did not return to the quarters at dusk. He noticed that when the master said, "Leave it be," no one touched what followed, even if it lay broken in plain sight. The boy began to mark these sounds quietly, the way one might mark fence posts along a long road. Not writing them down, not repeating them, only placing them carefully in memory, where they could not be taken away. He did not ask what words meant. Asking would have undone everything. Instead, he watched what happened after words were spoken. Language revealed itself through action. A command was not defined by its sound, but by its weight. When men laughed after speaking, the words were harmless. When they fell quiet, the words were sharp. He learned to listen for pauses. The breath drawn before an order mattered as much as the order itself. A sentence spoken cleanly was meant to be followed. A sentence spoken through clenched teeth was meant to be endured. A sentence spoken carelessly, those were the most dangerous of all. Careless words were often truer than careful ones. The boy noticed that men spoke differently depending on who they believed could understand them. Around visitors, language was dressed neatly, like a coat worn for show. Around the enslaved, it loosened. Around him, it was stripped bare. This was because they believed he was deaf to sense. So he trained himself not only to hear, but to appear untouched by sound. His face did not change when names were spoken. His body did not stiffen when punishment was discussed. He learned to swallow reactions the way others swallowed words. This control took time. More than once, he nearly betrayed himself. A sudden turn of phrase, an unexpected cruelty spoken plainly. These tested him. But he learned restraint by watching others fail at it. He saw how quickly a glance could be noticed, how a tightening jaw could draw attention. He learned that the safest expression was none at all. Listening became habit, and habit became discipline. He positioned himself where voices gathered, near the stable doors at dawn, beside the water barrel in the heat of the day, just outside the house when the windows were open and the master believed the yard empty. Always close enough to hear, never close enough to be addressed. He was careful never to linger too long. Lingering invites suspicion. Instead, he passed through spaces slowly, naturally, as though carried by routine rather than intention. He learned the rhythm of the place. When voices rose, when they fell, when secrets were spoken out of boredom rather than caution. Some evenings, he lay awake replaying sounds rather than events. He arranged words in his mind, testing them against what he had seen. Slowly, connections formed. Orders were not random. They followed patterns. Certain men always spoke before others. Certain words always ended discussion. The boy learned hierarchy not from titles, but from tone. He also learned that men often forgot what they had said aloud. Words, once spoken, faded quickly from their minds. But for the boy, words were durable. They remained. They waited. This listening did not make him bold. It made him patient. He understood that knowing something did not require acting upon it. Knowledge, when held quietly, was safer than action taken too soon. He watched others rush to speak, rush to explain, rush to defend themselves and suffer for it. The boy did none of these things. He listened. And he waited. What the men did not understand was that listening, practiced daily, becomes sharper than speaking. A listener learns not only words, but habits. Not only commands, but the manner in which commands are given. The boy began to anticipate speech before it happened. He could tell when an order was coming by the way a man stood, the way his shoulders settled, the way his voice prepared itself. This foresight did not free him, but it steadied him. By the time the listening habit was fully formed, the boy no longer heard words as separate sounds. He heard intent. He heard weakness. He heard carelessness. And he understood something quietly dangerous. A man who believes no one is listening speaks as though his words have no witness. The boy became that witness. And once a command is heard clearly, truly heard, it cannot be unheard. No one ever taught the boy their language. There were no lessons, no patience, no slow repetition meant to guide him toward understanding. Whatever he learned came without consent, gathered the way one gathers rainwater, by placing oneself where it was sure to fall. On the plantation in 1870 Texas, language was treated as a possession. It belonged to those who issued commands and those who were expected to answer. To understand without being invited was, in itself, a kind of trespass. The boy learned this early, and so he learned quietly. At first, words reached him without meaning. They were sounds shaped by habit, thrown into the air without care for where they landed. He did not grasp them as sentences, only as signals. A name spoken sharply, a phrase repeated often, a tone that turned men rigid or sent them moving without pause. Meaning came later, slowly, unevenly, drawn not from explanation, but from consequence. The boy watched what happened after certain words were spoken. He saw a man summoned and not return. He saw tools removed from a place after a quiet instruction. He saw work change direction at the sound of a single phrase. In this way, language revealed itself through result rather than rule. Some words carried weight because of who spoke them. Others carried weight because of where they were spoken. The boy learned that the same phrase spoken in the yard meant something different than when spoken near the house. Words, he discovered, were shaped by their surroundings. He learned, too, that not all orders were meant to be understood. Some were spoken only to satisfy temper or to establish dominance. These words often changed meaning later. The boy learned to distinguish between commands that would be enforced and commands that would be forgotten by morning. This skill saved him more than once. Because he was not expected to understand, the boy was present when men spoke carelessly. They argued over instructions. They corrected one another. They contradicted themselves. The boy observed these moments closely, for contradiction was a form of truth. When two men disagreed about an order, the order was weaker than it appeared. Language, he learned, was not solid, it bent. He learned phrases whole before understanding their parts. Certain combinations of words appeared together so often that they became single units in his mind. He did not yet know their precise meanings, but he knew their effect. When spoken, they ended discussion. When repeated, they invited trouble. He learned to store these phrases intact, like tools he might one day need. The boy also learned that language was used to assign blame. When something went wrong, men searched for words that placed responsibility elsewhere. Phrases like, "I said," and "you were told," appeared suddenly, shaped carefully to shield the speaker. The boy listened closely during these moments. They revealed which words mattered most when consequences followed. He noticed that those who spoke least often suffered the most. Silence offered no defense. And yet, the boy remained silent still, not because silence was protection, but because premature speech was danger. Understanding came without celebration. There was no moment when the boy realized he could understand everything being said. Comprehension crept in quietly, almost unnoticed. One day, a sentence spoken behind him made sense from beginning to end. The boy did not react. He did not allow the moment to show on his face. He simply accepted it and moved on. From that point forward, he began to test his understanding carefully, not by speaking, but by predicting. When an order was given, he anticipated what would follow. When he was correct, he stored the knowledge away. When he was wrong, he adjusted. In this way, language became something he handled with care. He understood that to reveal his comprehension would be to invite control. Those who knew he understood would shape their words around him. They would speak less freely. They would watch him more closely. His value lay in their ignorance. So he allowed them to believe what they wished. Language without permission taught him more than words. It taught him how men thought. It taught him how authority disguised itself as routine. It taught him how cruelty often arrived dressed as instruction. The boy learned that orders were rarely questioned aloud, but often doubted inwardly. He heard hesitation masked as confidence. He heard fear disguised as anger. These things mattered more than vocabulary. He also learned that the law of the plantation was spoken, not written. What was said mattered more than what was right, and because words faded quickly from the mouths that spoke them, they could be turned, twisted, or denied. Unless someone remembered them exactly. The boy remembered. He remembered phrasing. He remembered timing. He remembered who stood where when words were spoken. He remembered the tone used and the silence that followed. These details mattered. They were proof, should proof ever be required. By learning language without permission, the boy gained something dangerous. Not power, not freedom, but precision. He understood that men bound themselves with their own words, often without realizing it. And he understood something else, as well. A command spoken aloud does not belong only to the man who gives it. It belongs to anyone who hears it clearly enough to act. The boy did not yet act, but he listened with care, knowing that one day, words meant for others might offer him a narrow path of his own. Trust did not come to the boy as reward. It came as neglect. By 1870 in Texas, the plantation ran on habits older than memory. Men moved along familiar paths, repeating familiar tasks, rarely stopping to examine why one person was chosen over another. When the boy was first sent alone on errands, it was not because he had proven himself capable, but because no one imagined him capable of mischief. He had been quiet so long that quiet had become his reputation. The master noticed this. He noticed that the boy did not wander when sent away. He noticed that things arrived where they were meant to arrive. He noticed that the boy returned promptly, empty-handed and empty-faced. In a place where resistance often announced itself loudly, this steadiness felt like obedience. So the boy was given distance. At first, the errands were small. Carrying water from the well to the stable, fetching a tool left behind in the yard, delivering a message that could have been spoken aloud, but was not worth the master's breath. Each task placed the boy briefly beyond direct supervision. No one followed him. They did not think it necessary. The boy was small, slow-spoken, and believed to understand little beyond direction of hand and sharpness of voice. He was not thought clever enough to stray, nor bold enough to linger. His usefulness lay in his simplicity. The boy accepted the errands without comment. He did not hurry, but neither did he delay. He learned quickly that time itself was watched. A task done too fast invited suspicion, one done too slow invited correction. He matched the pace expected of him, which was neither urgent nor careful. As the errands increased, so did the spaces he was allowed to cross alone. He walked between the quarters and the fields, between the stable and the smokehouse, between the back steps of the house and the shaded yard where men gathered to speak freely. These paths became familiar, and familiarity breeds invisibility. Along these routes, the boy heard more than messages. He heard arguments break off as he passed, then resume once he was thought out of earshot. He heard instructions spoken twice, once carefully, once carelessly. He heard men repeat themselves when they thought the first version had not been heard by the right ears. Because he carried messages, he learned how messages changed. An order spoken in irritation softened by the time it reached its destination. A request framed as command lost its edge when repeated by someone without authority. The boy noticed which words were kept intact and which were adjusted along the way. This taught him that language was not fixed, it was carried, and therefore altered. Sometimes he was sent with no words at all, only an expectation, a nod toward the fields, a glance toward the house. In these moments, the boy was expected to infer meaning from habit. He succeeded because he had been watching habits for years. The master began to rely on this. He spoke around the boy rather than to him. Send him, he would say, without specifying what or where. The boy understood from context. He went where he was meant to go. He returned when he was meant to return. Each success confirmed the belief that he required no explanation. This was the most dangerous kind of trust, because the boy was trusted with errands. He was present during moments meant to be private. He stood outside doors while voices rose within. He waited at fence lines while men discussed matters that would later be denied. He held reins while decisions were made behind him. No one guarded their speech in his presence. Why would they? He was thought to carry only objects, not understanding. The boy learned the timing of the place. He learned when the overseer was absent. He learned when the master spoke carelessly, believing the day's work already settled. He learned which messages were urgent and which were meant only to assert authority. He did not act on this knowledge. Acting would have revealed him. Instead, he treated knowledge the same way he treated the messages he carried, with care, with accuracy, and without alteration. What the men did not see was that each errand expanded the boy's map of the world. not just of paths and buildings, but of power. He learned who spoke for whom. He learned whose words could move others without resistance. He learned where authority ended and where it only pretended to exist. He also learned the value of being underestimated. Because he was sent alone, no one counted his steps. Because he returned reliably, no one questioned his route. Because he spoke little, no one asked what he had heard. The boy began to understand that errands were not merely tasks. They were permissions. Permissions to move, to observe, to listen without suspicion. Each errand placed him in spaces where truth slipped loose. And truth, once overheard, could not be returned to its speaker. By the time the boy was trusted with longer errands, those that took him beyond sight, beyond the bend in the road, he had already learned the limits of that trust. It extended only as far as their assumptions did. They trusted him because they believed him incapable of intention. The boy carried their words faithfully, even as he learned how easily words could betray the men who spoke them. He carried tools, water, messages, and silently, he carried something else as well, a growing understanding of how order was maintained, and how it might one day be undone without a single word being spoken aloud. Trust, given carelessly, becomes a door left unlatched. The boy did not rush through it. He simply noted that it was there. The instruction was not meant for him. That was what made it powerful. It came on an afternoon when the heat pressed low against the land, thick enough to quiet even the birds. Work had slowed into habit, and habit bred carelessness. The boy had been sent with a small errand. Nothing spoken aloud, only a glance toward the back of the house and a pause that meant wait. So he waited. He stood near the open window where the shade fell longest, eyes lowered, hands folded, body arranged in the manner expected of him. Inside, voices carried easily. They were unguarded voices, the kind men use when they believe themselves alone. The master spoke first. His tone was tired, edged with irritation rather than anger. The overseer answered, low and confident, as though the matter were already settled. They spoke of tomorrow, of timing, of who would be sent and who would not. The boy listened as he always did, without urgency, without reaction. At first, the words blended into the familiar pattern of planning and complaint. Then a sentence fell differently. It was spoken plainly. Too plainly. An instruction was given, not shouted, not disguised, not weighed carefully. It was framed as certainty, as something already decided. The master did not look toward the window when he spoke it. He did not lower his voice. He did not pause to consider who might hear. He assumed the boy understood nothing of what was said. The boy understood every word. He did not move. He did not lift his head. He did not allow his breathing to change. He let the sentence settle in his mind, the way one lets dust settle after a door has been closed. The instruction was specific. It named a place. It named a time. It named an action. There was no room for confusion in its wording. That was what made it dangerous. The overseer repeated part of it, altering nothing, only confirming what had been said. The master agreed. The matter was closed. Voices turned to other things. Laughter followed, a short, careless sound. The boy remained where he was until he was dismissed with a wave of the hand. As he walked away, carrying nothing but the expectation that he would return when needed, the instruction repeated itself in his mind. He did not rehearse it nervously. He did not question it. He examined it. He examined the order the way a carpenter examines a beam, looking for cracks, for weight, for the way it might bear pressure. He considered the exact words used. He considered what was said and what was not. Men often believe meaning lies in intention. The boy knew better. Meaning lay in phrasing. The instruction had been spoken as command, not suggestion. It had been spoken aloud in the presence of others, without qualification. That mattered. Words spoken that way carried authority beyond the speaker's intent. Still, the boy did nothing. That evening passed as all evenings did. Supper came and went. The quarters settled. Darkness fell. The boy lay awake longer than usual, not because of fear, but because of thought. He replayed the instruction again and again, testing it against what he knew of the place. He asked himself no questions of morality. Such questions had no place in his world. He asked only practical ones. Could the instruction be followed exactly? Could it be followed without drawing attention? Could it be followed in a way that could not be easily undone? He did not yet decide. Morning came. The day unfolded along expected lines. No one spoke of the instruction again. Men often believed that silence erased what had been said the day before. The boy knew silence only concealed it. As the hours passed, he noticed something else. No correction was offered. No new order replaced the old one. The instruction stood alone, unaltered, waiting. By midday, the boy understood that the order was still in effect. Not because it was repeated, but because it was not withdrawn. In that place, what was not corrected was confirmed. He felt no satisfaction in this knowledge. Only clarity. He went about his errands as usual. He spoke to no one. He listened more carefully than ever. He watched for signs that the instruction had been reconsidered. There were none. The master moved through the day with the ease of a man untroubled by doubt. That, too, was important. The boy understood that careless instructions were the most binding. A man who speaks without caution rarely imagines his words will be examined closely. He assumes they will be carried out only in the manner he intended, not in the manner he described. But the boy had learned that intention did not matter once words left the mouth. By late afternoon, the time named in the instruction approached. The boy positioned himself where he could observe without being observed. He watched men move according to habit, unaware that one of their own words was about to be handled differently. Still, he waited. He waited because patience had taught him that the most dangerous moment was not when an order was given, but when it was about to be obeyed. That was when men noticed things. That was when mistakes were caught. The boy would not make a mistake. When he finally moved, he did so quietly, precisely, and without deviation. He did not add to the instruction. He did not subtract from it. He followed it as spoken, not as intended. That was the difference. The instruction had been overheard, yes. But more than that, it had been understood. An understanding, when combined with patience, can turn a careless sentence into something its speaker never imagined. The boy did not smile. He did not feel triumph. He felt only the steady certainty of someone doing exactly what he had been told. Nothing more, nothing less. And in that exactness, the balance of the place began to shift. Fear came first. It always did. The boy felt it the moment the instruction settled fully in his mind. Not as a sudden jolt, but as a slow tightening, like a rope drawn inch by inch. He understood what the order meant. He understood what could follow if it were carried out in the wrong way, or at the wrong time, or by the wrong person. Knowledge did not make him brave. It made him cautious, but fear did not command him. Patience did. He had learned long ago that fear demanded immediacy. Fear urged movement, reaction, escape. It whispered that delay was danger. Yet everything the boy had survived taught him the opposite. In that place, haste invited notice, and notice invited consequence. So he waited. Waiting did not mean idleness. It meant attention sharpened to its finest edge. He watched the men who had spoken the instruction, not for what they did, but for what they failed to do. He noted whether the master corrected himself. He noted whether the overseer altered his tone when issuing later orders. Silence, when it followed speech, could be either forgetfulness or confidence. The boy learned to tell the difference. Days earlier, he might have acted too soon. Now, he knew better. He understood that an instruction, once spoken, existed in a fragile state. It could be withdrawn, amended, or replaced. Acting while it was still unstable would expose him. Acting once it had hardened into assumption, that was safer. So he waited for signs of permanence. He waited through the morning, when men are sharpest. He waited through midday, when tempers fray but minds wander. He waited through the afternoon, when habits resume their hold. Each passing hour without correction strengthened the instruction's authority. Fear rose and fell within him during this waiting, but he treated it as weather. He did not fight it. He did not surrender to it. He allowed it to pass through him, unchanged by expression. He had learned that fear, when concealed, loses some of its power. Patience had been taught to him not by choice, but by necessity. He had watched those who reacted too quickly, who spoke when silence was safer, who moved when stillness would have protected them. Their mistakes were not always punished immediately. Sometimes punishment came later, detached from cause, making it all the more devastating. The boy did not intend to join them. He understood that patience was not the absence of fear, but the arrangement of it. Fear placed carefully to one side, like a tool not yet needed. He allowed himself to feel it only enough to remain careful. As the named time approached, the boy slowed his movements further. He did not wish to appear eager. Eagerness attracts attention. Instead, he behaved as he always had, predictable, forgettable, obedient in appearance. He watched the paths fill and empty. He noted where eyes lingered and where they did not. He observed who was tired, who was distracted, who was confident enough to look away. Patience required not only waiting, but choosing the precise moment when waiting should end. That moment did not arrive suddenly. It came quietly, almost unnoticed. A shift in sound, a change in routine so slight that only someone listening closely would recognize it. The overseer left earlier than usual. The master did not remain near the yard. Authority thinned without announcing its absence. The boy felt fear again then, sharper this time. The kind of fear that asks whether one has waited too long, whether opportunity has already passed, but he resisted it. He had learned that fear also lies. He tested the situation without committing himself. A small movement. A brief pause. He watched for reaction. There was none. The world continued as it had a moment before. That was when he understood. The time had arrived not because conditions were perfect, but because they were ordinary. Ordinariness was protection. Had the moment felt dramatic, he would have waited longer. Drama invites memory. What the boy required was forgettability. He needed his actions to disappear into routine. Even then, he did not act immediately. He waited long enough for fear to dull again. Fear that is too sharp can betray itself through the body, through breath, through posture, through haste. Only when it settled back into a low, steady presence did he move. When he did, his movements were exact. He followed the instruction as spoken, step by step, without embellishment. He did not correct it. He did not improve upon it. He did not hesitate where the order did not specify hesitation. Patience had taught him that obedience, when taken literally, can be a shield. Throughout it all, fear remained. It did not vanish, but it was no longer in command. It was contained, measured, kept behind the discipline of waiting. The boy understood then something essential. Patience was not passive. It was an active choice made again and again. To wait one breath longer, one step further, one moment past the point where fear demanded retreat. When the instruction was finally fulfilled, it did not feel like release. It felt like completion, like a sentence ended properly, with no words out of place. Only afterward did the boy allow himself to reflect on what he had done, not with pride, but with care. He examined whether patience had served him as intended, whether fear had been mastered, not erased. It had. In choosing patience over fear, the boy did not make himself visible. He did not announce intelligence. He did not challenge authority openly. He did something far quieter and far more dangerous. He proved that fear could be endured without surrender, and that waiting, true waiting, could turn a single careless instruction into an irreversible act. And once patience has done its work, fear has nothing left to say. The boy did not change the order. He changed how it stood. He had learned that most men believed words behaved obediently. Spoken once, they marched forward in the direction intended, carrying purpose neatly along with them. Few considered that words, like tools, could be turned slightly in the hand and still remain the same object. The instruction he had overheard was clear. That was its weakness. It contained no conditions, no cautions, no second voice to temper it. It named an action and assumed understanding would fill the rest. The master trusted that whoever heard it would interpret it properly, meaning as the master himself would have done. The boy knew better. He had listened too long to believe intention mattered more than phrasing. Men often hid behind what they meant to say, not what they said, but meaning could not be measured. Words could, so the boy held to the words. He repeated them silently, not altering a syllable. He examined where they ended and where they did not. He noted what they required and what they failed to forbid. The gaps were important. Gaps were spaces where movement could occur without disobedience. He did not hurry to exploit those spaces. He waited until he could step into them without drawing notice. When he did, it was with care, as one might place a foot on uncertain ground, trusting balance rather than force. The boy followed the instruction exactly. This exactness was his shield. When the time came, he did what the words commanded, no more, no less. He did not interpret tone. He did not correct assumed intent. He did not pause to ask what the master might have meant had he spoken more carefully. He obeyed the sentence, not the speaker. This was something the men had never considered possible. They believed obedience required understanding aligned with authority. They did not imagine obedience could be literal, detached, and still complete. The boy had learned that literal obedience was the safest kind. As he carried out the order, he noticed how easily routine absorbed his actions. Nothing appeared out of place. No voice rose to question him. The instruction fit neatly into the day's rhythm because it had been spoken as part of that rhythm. Words, once released into routine, become invisible. Others moved around him, following their own orders, unaware that one instruction was being handled differently. To them, nothing had changed. The boy was still quiet, still compliant, still beneath notice. Only the outcome would reveal the difference, and even then, not immediately. When the result of the instruction became evident, confusion followed rather than accusation. Men searched backward for explanation, but words had already done their work. The instruction, when repeated aloud, sounded correct, reasonable, irrefutable. That was the boy's protection. If questioned, he could only answer with the words themselves. He could not explain motive. He could not defend intention. He could only point to what had been said. And what had been said, spoken by authority, stood firm. The boy understood that power often collapses when forced to examine its own language. Men do not like to be reminded of what they have spoken carelessly. They prefer to correct silently, to shift blame, to let time blur responsibility. But words remembered precisely resist blurring. The boy did not need to accuse anyone. The instruction accused itself. Its clarity became its undoing. The more closely it was examined, the more obvious it became that it had been followed. This unsettled the men. They were not angry at the boy, not at first. Anger requires certainty of fault. What they felt instead was discomfort, a sense that something had slipped from their grasp without open resistance. They began to speak more cautiously after that, not around the boy, around everyone. Their voices lowered. Their sentences grew longer, burdened with conditions and corrections. Language tightened. The boy noticed this change, but did not acknowledge it. To acknowledge it would be to reveal cause. He remained what he had always appeared to be, a child who did as he was told. But inside, something had shifted. He had proven to himself that words could be used without raising the hand or lifting the voice. That obedience did not always serve authority. That precision could be a form of quiet resistance. He did not mistake this for victory. Victory was loud, and loud things do not last. What he had achieved was narrower and safer a margin. A small space carved from someone else's certainty. He understood now that men feared disorder more than disobedience. Disorder forced them to look inward, to question their own speech, their own habits. It required effort. By following the instruction exactly, the boy had introduced disorder without defiance. He had turned the words sideways. From that day forward, he listened differently. Not just for opportunity, but for weakness in language. He listened for sentences spoken too cleanly, orders issued without thought, commands assumed rather than enforced. He understood that every careless word carried the seed of its own unraveling. And he understood something else as well. Once words have been obeyed literally, they cannot be reclaimed. Authority cannot punish obedience without admitting fault. The boy carried this knowledge quietly. He did not plan further acts. Planning invites expectation. Instead, he waited, knowing that words would continue to be spoken, and that men would continue to underestimate the power of being heard by someone they believed incapable of understanding. Words turned sideways do not shout. They do not strike. They simply stand unchanged until those who spoke them realize, too late, that obedience has many shapes, and some of them bend power back upon itself. The consequence did not arrive with noise. It came as absence. By the next morning, the plantation's rhythm was unsettled, though no one could point to a single moment when it broke. Men moved more slowly. Orders were repeated. Instructions were spoken twice, then corrected, then spoken again. What had once flowed without question now stumbled over its own certainty. The boy noticed this before anyone else did. He noticed how men paused before speaking, as though weighing words that once came freely. He noticed glances exchanged where voices used to suffice. He noticed that the master's tone had changed, not sharper, but narrower, constrained by caution. Something had gone wrong, but nothing appeared broken. That was the difficulty. The instruction had been carried out exactly as spoken. There was no disobedience to punish, no open defiance to crush. The men searched for fault and found only their own words standing intact, unchanged, impossible to argue against without undoing themselves. The boy did not linger to observe reactions. Lingering invites memory. He returned to his usual place, his usual posture, his usual silence. He did not look for acknowledgement. He did not seek recognition. He had learned that visibility was not reward, it was danger. Still, the air had shifted. When the overseer spoke later that day, his sentences grew heavy with conditions. He named times twice. He clarified places that had once been assumed. The master corrected himself mid-speech, stopping to reconsider words already spoken. Language had lost its ease. The boy understood what had happened. Authority had been forced to look at itself. Men who believed themselves unquestionable had been confronted not by resistance, but by accuracy. They did not like what they saw, but they could not strike at the cause without revealing their own carelessness. So they adjusted instead. The boy was sent on fewer errands after that, not because he had erred, but because he had been present. Presence, once noticed, is rarely forgiven. Yet even in this withdrawal, he remained untouched. No accusation followed him. No punishment found him. Silence protected him. The boy accepted the change without reaction. He did not mourn the loss of movement. He had already learned what he needed to learn. The knowledge he carried did not require further proof. He returned to listening rather than acting. Days passed. Routine reasserted itself, but not fully. Something fragile remained. Words were spoken more carefully. Orders were hedged, guarded, weighed. Men did not forget what had happened. They simply chose not to speak of it. The boy understood this choice. Speaking would have required admission, and admission, in that place, was more dangerous than silence. So the event was folded into memory without ceremony. What remained with the boy was not triumph. He felt none. He had not escaped his condition. He had not altered his fate in any lasting way. But something within him had shifted permanently. He knew now that survival did not always depend on strength or speed. Sometimes it depended on remembering exactly what others forgot they had said. Sometimes it depended on standing still long enough to hear what was never meant for you. This knowledge did not make him reckless. It made him careful. He carried it the way one carries a hidden coin, not to spend, but to know it is there. He understood that there might never be another moment when such precision would serve him. That was acceptable. Knowing it was possible was enough. Years later, he would remember that afternoon not for what he did, but for what he did not do. He did not speak. He did not ask. He did not reveal himself. He survived by remaining unseen. The plantation would continue. Men would come and go. Words would be spoken and forgotten. The boy would grow older, his silence mistaken again and again for emptiness. But memory would remain with him. He would remember the sound of careless certainty. He would remember the weight of a sentence spoken without thought. He would remember how obedience, taken literally, could bend the world just enough to allow breath. And in remembering, he would endure. Not loudly, not privately, but quietly, as so many did, leaving no mark except the fact of having remained.